James Monroe slammed the phone down with a curse and headed straight for the fridge. Wrenching open the door, he stared at the ice-cold beer. His face contorted with anger. "Fuck it," he said, slamming closed the door and marching back into the living room. He stood in the middle of the room, his hands clenching and unclenching, with the need to lash out, to break something, anything. He stood that way for some time, his eyes closed, just breathing, until the anger passed and a great weariness fell over him, causing his legs to buckle, spilling him into a nearby chair. One beer, he thought, licking his dry lips. He'd do anything just for one goddamn beer. Yet he knew he couldn't do it. He had responsibilities. He had signed on with the NHS ambulance service at 8 o'clock that very morning, informing them that he was available as a first responder for the next 24 hours for Mavagazi and the surrounding areas. A decision that he was now starting to regret. Talking to Marcia always left him feeling this way. Lonely, hollowed out, in dire need of a drink. God damn her. She had been nothing but a pain in his ass for the 10 years they'd been married, and would probably continue to be so for another 10 years to come. If it weren't for the kids, he would completely cut her loose. The divorce had been hard enough on the kids already. The mother using them like some kind of weapon. No, hostages. To be dragged out like bargaining chips for her ever-increasing demands. Just then the phone let out a shrill shriek, causing him to start from his chair. Angrily, he crossed the room and grabbed it up in mid-ring. "James Monroe," he answered, twisting the cord between his fingers. "Hello, James? This is Jane." There was no need for pleasantries or last names. James had been an emergency responder for over 15 years. He knew every dispatcher by name, if not by voice alone. "Hello, Jane," he responded. "What's your emergency?" For a second, there was silence. Then Jane began to babble. "I'm sorry, James," she said hurriedly, "but I need your help. There's been some kind of explosion at St. Ausley's Brewery. All available units have been dispatched to the scene. Half the town is on fire. Then I get this call—" Slow down, he said. "Take a breath. Tell me what happened." "Okay," she said, and James could almost see her pulling herself back together. "The call came in about 5 minutes ago. A woman screaming about blood, begging for help for an ambulance. Completely out of control. I just managed to get an address, then the phone went dead." "Jesus," James replied, leaning heavily against the wall. "Have the police been informed? You know we're not allowed to walk into any situation with unknown factors, or a possible crime scene. And besides, you know we only carry basic medical supplies. I have the defibrillator and oxygen, but they aren't going to be much good if someone's bleeding to death." I know, Jane replied quickly. "As for the law, Andy Clutterbuck is your local constable. Has been informed and is on his way to the scene." "It's local then?" James asked. "Here in Mavagazi?" she said. "Yes, up at the old Van Draven place," she said, sounding more frantic than ever. "James, please say that you'll help. The phones are ringing like crazy, and I'm here on my own." "Sure," James heard himself say. "Radio Clutterbuck and tell him I'm on my way." He hung up on her thank yous, but didn't move. His back pressed against the wall, his eyes tight shut. The Van Draven House. "Mother of God," he prayed. "Please don't let anything have happened up there again." Moments later, he was in his car. His medical bag quickly tossed in the back seat as he drove through the night-shrouded streets of Mavagazi towards the old Van Draven place. Yes, old, James thought, as he headed up the school hill. The Van Draven house was old, all right. Built in 1836 by Lucas Van Draven, the house was both the site of suicide, multiple murders, and madness. Even the foundations of the house were stained with blood. In 1832, while the house was still under construction, 2 workers had died. One after falling from rain-soaked scaffolding, and the other crushed to death by falling masonry. That had only been the beginning. Less than a year later, Lucas Van Draven had gone insane, slaughtering his servant, his wife, and unborn child before throwing himself from a nearby cliff into the cold embrace of the waiting Atlantic. The house had lain empty for nearly 20 years until it was purchased once again by Arthur Millington, a wealthy boatmaker who had retired in Mevagissey to spend his few remaining years by the sea. He had been found dead 4 months later, hanging from a ceiling beam in what had once been Lucas Van Draven's study. After him, the Dorchester family had moved into the house in 1910 and had promptly gone missing. The house had stood empty then for nearly 60 years, cursed and shunned by all, until the Jonas family moved in. The husband had been a painter and decorator who had holidayed in Mevagissey often and had finally decided to move down from Manchester to set up shop. He had seen the old Van Draven estate up for sale for an unbelievably small price and had immediately snatched it up, laughing at local superstitions and unconcerned by stories of its grisly past. He had moved his wife and 2 children right in and had started immediate renovations on the old place. At first, everything seemed to be going okay, and the village began to relax. Until the summer of '72, when the whole family was found dead in the basement, their bodies torn and twisted, as if by some terrible force. And now, over 40 years later, another family from out of town had settled in with dreams of renovating the old place back to its former glory. James drove through the night towards the very same house, spurred on by a cry for help and blood-fueled phone call. For a moment he slowed down, his own terror almost overwhelming him, but it was too late. He had already turned onto Beach Road, the Van Draven house looming before him as he came to an abrupt halt behind Andy Clutterbuck's clapped-out old Nissan Micra. He just sat there then, head down, taking one deep breath after another, trying to get his swirling emotions under control before clambering out of the car, grabbing up his med kit, and reluctantly turning to face the Van Draven place. The Van Draven house was more than a house. It was in fact a small mansion, set a little apart from the more modern houses of Beach Road, behind crumbling stone walls. It overlooked the dark waters of the Atlantic like some broken idol, a monument to both madness and murder. James started forward, squeezing through the rusted gates, and suddenly stopped. The front door was hanging wide open. The house was almost in complete darkness except for what seemed to be a small light burning somewhere in the back of the house. Slowly, he approached the front door, taking a small torch from his jacket pocket. He clicked it on and flashed it just inside the hallway. "Clutterbuck," he hissed. "You in there?" But there was nothing. Only the sighing of the wind and the rustle of autumn leaves. Laying down his bag, he flashed the torch up and down the rotten plaster walls, looking for a light switch, but found only a square hole with some new-looking wires poking through, and guessed correctly that the new family, the Malins, he believed they were called, were having the old place rewired as part of their ongoing restorations. Slowly, he picked up his bag, trying to ignore how the light in his hand trembled, throwing long shadows as he stepped inside. It was the smell that hit him first. The smell of decay, of rotting plaster, mildew, old black mold. He wondered how anyone in their right mind would bring their children to such a place. "Hello?" he called again. But there was still nothing, only the same waiting stillness. Creeping forward, he walked down the hall until it opened up into a large marble room with winding staircase that led up to an unseen balcony on the house's second floor. To his right was a large ornate wooden door from which a dim light burned beneath. With an arm that seemed to stretch for miles, he slowly pushed open the door. The room he stepped into was a complete contrast to what he had seen in the rest of the house. Here the walls were freshly plastered, the wooden floors swept and buffed down to a mirror shine with thick new rugs as a makeshift carpet. In the corner, rolled neatly away, were 4 sleeping bags, 2 large red and blue and 2 small, one pink with unicorns and another blue with Thomas the Tank Engine. By the boarded-up window was a mini DVD player and a 2-ring camping stove. And James surmised but the family were living out of this single room while the renovations were getting underway. "Hello?" he called, unnerved by the silence. "Is anyone home? Ambulance service." He was answered by a muffled groan coming from a so far unnoticed door. The noise came again, and he hurriedly flashed his torch around until he found the door and quickly pushed through, his fear forgotten as his medical training kicked in. The room he found himself in had at one time been a sort of kitchen or preparation area, and like the other room, was in the middle of being renovated. Some of the worktops and cupboards were brand new, but the walls were still covered in rotten plaster and broken kitchen tiles. James flashed his torch around, looking for someone in distress, perhaps slumped in a darkened corner. His light flashed across the floor, and he took a sharp intake of breath. There was blood here. A long smear of it leading to a small wooden door built into the back of the room that now stood slightly ajar. As James approached, he noticed a yellow flickering that caused small shadows to dance and undulate in the doorway. "Hello?" he croaked, his mouth suddenly dry, his tongue feeling large and swollen. "Ambulance service." He was on autopilot now, his legs carrying him forward as he pushed open the door, revealing the wooden steps slick with moss and cold earth walls running with moisture. He was halfway down when the smell hit him. A harsh, coppery smell like pennies, held too long in a tight fist. And suddenly his fear, which had sat like a cold stone in the pit of his stomach, overcame him. The flesh in his arms started to crawl as the hair on the back of his neck became erect, his whole body breaking out into great knots of goose flesh. He would have turned to flee, but his will was no longer his own. As he reached the bottom of the stairs and turned the corner, Andy Clusterbuck sat naked in the middle of the room, naked and covered in blood. He was surrounded by candles that cast dancing shadows all about him. As James watched on in horror, Clusterbuck raised a large carving knife and began to carve the skin from his face. He let out a sort of groan as he ground the tip of the blade under his eye and drew the knife downward, splitting his cheek, revealing the bone beneath. He saw James and grinned through bloody teeth. "He killed them," he said, pointing at the bodies all about him. "They tried to hide it from them, but he dug it out of them using this." He raised the bloody knife. "He told me a secret before he cut his own throat. He told me that there's something buried here, something that burrows and worms itself inside and hides, but I'll find it. You can help me find it," he said, driving the knife through his cheek. We can find it together." James turned then. His paralysis broken, he fled screaming up the steps, his bladder letting go as he screeched and gibbered, stumbling and falling through the Draven House, which now seemed to be coming to life all around him. From the shadows, faces loomed, some laughed, others screaming. Blood-curdling shrieks of agony echoed through the broken caverns of his mind, and somewhere, far away, a baby cried and a woman screamed her denial and terror. He burst through the front door, escaping the reaching shadows, and fled, stumbling into the night. Overhead, an uncaring moon sailed over the now silent Draven House. Inside, mice scurried through the walls. The floorboards creaked and dust motes stirred as if moved by some unseen presence. A grandfather clock chimed softly. And the house waited, and waited, and waited. Good evening once again, kids. It's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I want to tell you thank you for watching tonight's video, or for listening to tonight's episode of the podcast that's available on Spotify, or on Apple Music, or on any other places that you can get podcasts. If you guys have loved any of the series you've been hearing on the channel, such as the Neverglade Mysteries, My Tiny Town Has Just Been Put on Lockdown, or Tales from the Gas Station, and you've wondered if there's more, there is. Take a look on Amazon.
All these authors and many more have books available on Amazon right now, and some of them I've even done the audiobooks for. Check them out now, see if you can pick up a novel or two, and let them know that I sent you. As always, I want to give a big thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon. You guys are the real MVPs, and you allow us to get a whole bunch of custom stories that are only heard here on this channel, on this podcast. So, a very big thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Stephanie Butler, Bobby Karman, Tristan Pelton, Chase Burnett, Diana Kraus, Maria Walker, Tonya Oran, Paingravy, Inactive Hermit, Austin Johnson, Crazy Kid, MrMarcusBlitz, Aika Limchoc, Dirt Diver 030, Matt Bach, Jabbles Raz, Voiceofsand, Coffee Zombie, Matthew McNeese, ChellyJay, Jeremy H, raltizal, PhycoMel, Nana, TheMorrigan, Nick Weaver, MeltedLake, Tali Sue, SkyMara Ravenswood, William King, Reaper 61167, Darth Miver, Micah Ortiz, Satanic Aries, Nessie, Parafa Panda, Bardo Hawk 764, Lambda M98, Harley, Billy Morrow, Sashi Suzaku, My Body Sounds Like Rice Krispies, Miss Xander, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Azarine Fox, Freddy Krueger, Happy Birthday Jason Wilson, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiri the Sloth, Tommy Green, Fester's Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, Trey Smiles, and Corey Kenshin. And of course, everybody who's down there in the description as well, and everybody who can support on patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta for even $1. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for listening, and sweet dreams.